public intellectual in Turkey. He now teaches at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. No longer considered a threat by its neighbors, the Turkey that relied heavily on its hard power, that shunned the Middle East, where the military called all the important shots, segued into a Turkey that was capable of deploying its soft power. He's talking about the last decade or so. It set an example of a country that could integrate its Islamists into the political system, continue in its democratic practices, and show impressive economic growth. Arab citizens discovered Turkey in ever-growing numbers, just as Turkish TV series started to dominate primetime airwaves throughout the region. As Turkey's policy towards its neighbors gradually became less confrontational, the benefits of the Israeli alignment became relatively less impressive than before. In the meantime, the architect of that alignment on the Turkish side, that is the alignment with Israel, the military, was fast losing political ground as a result of intensive civilianization and further democratization of the polity, as well as indictments against its members for alleged coup plots and other illicit activities. Let me shift to one of our Israeli authors, Shlomo Brom, who's the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies. He concludes that in this new Middle East with shifting power balances and competitions, that Israel, in its kind of bunker mentality, still has some openings, but has to be astute in figuring out how to exploit them. He says, the competition between Turkey and Iran and the potential competition between Egypt and these two states creates some room for Israel to maneuver among these competing powers in cooperation with the United States. This possible opportunity is conditioned on Israel's ability to change the atmosphere in its relationship with the Arab world by new peace initiatives. It is difficult to envisage Israel being capable of maneuvering in this space in a situation of growing enmity between it and its Arab neighbors. The latter situation would provide a fertile ground for Iran to expand its influence and its brand of change, while for its part, Turkey would have no choice but to stand with the Arabs and against Israel. Otherwise, it would have no chance of competing with Iran in the Arab world. Let me turn to another of our authors on Israel, Daniel Levy from the New America Foundation, and somewhere I've got him, yes, who talks a little bit about what he sees as the debate within Israel over which way Israel should orient its policies. He says, overall, Turkey might be seen as a powerful example of the terrain on which a battle is being fought between what one might call the realists and the denialists in Israel. That has been made all the more stark by the recent changes in the region and what those might presage. Arab regimes in the Middle East that are more responsive to public opinion might well pursue policies toward Israel that more closely resemble those of Turkey under the AKP. Israeli realists will suggest that Israel will have to adjust to this reality by, among other things, changing its approach to the Palestinians and being less absolutist in its demands of those with whom it has relations. The denialists will have Israel attempt to ally itself ever more closely with the West, as they try to convince Western publics that they are in a common civilizational struggle with Israel against radical Islam, and would dig in policy terms. That the denialists are currently very much in the ascendancy is borne out in Israel's policy toward Turkey. One of our authors, Greg Gause from the University of Vermont, who wrote about American policy, ended up concluding a few points on how the Arab Spring might play out as an issue in this triangular relationship. He says, although we do not know how the politics of any of the Arab countries affected by these events will shake out, we can assume that more democratic politics in these countries will complicate their relations with both the United States and with Israel. The Turkish case indicates that a more democratic and Islamist government does not necessarily mean a complete break with the United States on the model of revolutionary Iran, but it does mean more distance in the relationship and more difficulties in strategic cooperation. The Turkish case also indicates that a more democratic and Islamist government means a more difficult relationship with Israel. even if it does not mean open conflict and the rupturing of diplomatic relations. Finally, one of our commentators with considerable experience in government, Phil Zelikow, one of my colleagues at University of Virginia, who worked in the recent Bush administration, compared dealing with Turkey today with Israel. He says that if you examine the specific content of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, what are the issues that appear in the inboxes of American policymakers when they deal with Israel? He said, there are some things that involve constructive cooperation, technological innovation, global financial cooperation. There has been important constructive cooperation on some issues to do with Iran, though Israel would be taking the initiative on these issues by itself, if necessary. But mainly, U.S. policymakers encounter issues involving Israel in the defensive part of their inbox, under damage control and danger control. The Israelis are not able to play a very active role on many issues that go beyond Israel. Then he turns to the U.S.-Turkish relationship. He says the U.S.-Turkish relationship is almost non-existent in public consciousness in the United States, but increasingly strong among elites, and the scope of its constructive relationships is broad and broadening. Think about the scope of issues in which Turkey is constructively involved with the United States, geographically, regionally, in subject matter, hard power, soft power. In the conference, he went on about Iraq, Afghanistan, northern Kurdistan, and so forth. And you could add to that now Libya and possibly Syria. And you begin to see the range of issues that come into the inbox concerning Turkey and the contrast between that and U.S.-Israeli relations. So that's just a sampling of some of the views that the authors bring to this. I hope you'll be interested to pick it up and read it. It's short, that's an advantage, and it has quite a bit of meat for understanding some of these contemporary issues in it, in my humble opinion. So thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Bill. As you can this is more than just a triangle. As you can see, this is variable geometry with lots of different lines going in different directions. I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, Lara, it might be easier if you stood. If I think it's, since the room is crowded, if you don't mind, I think that might work better. Thanks.
Are you sitting on short? Thanks. It's great being here today. It's a little intimidating. This is not my normal stomping ground either. These issues I focus on Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab issues. I will say that this is a great book. You should read it, and I can prove that I read it because I highlighted it extensively because I actually thought I was being asked to talk about the book. So, not a book report. But I have some observations, and my starting point is going to be the observation I had when I was first asked to speak today, which is how interesting it is that I am asked to speak today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lara Friedman. I do policy and government relations for an organization called Americans for Peace Now. And I am a policy wonk, but I'm a policy wonk who comes from the Jewish left. I sit in what is well known as a left-wing organization. If this event were taking place 3 years ago, it would obviously be very different because the situation would be different. But you'd probably have had someone up here from the American Jewish Committee or B'nai B'rith or maybe AIPAC, because this was not a relationship that was really interesting to the Jewish left. We didn't need to be involved. This relationship was going really, really well. So you had trips organized for members of Congress by Jewish groups every year. The real driver of this relationship came from the U.S. military and from the Israeli military. So I was sort of thinking back on the dates in this book, and it's kind of fun to read a book that's about things that are recent enough that you can be like, wow, yeah, that is exactly what happened. And I went back through my Outlook file, and the first meeting I ever had with a Turkish diplomat in my professional capacity was in November 2009, when I was sought out to have the conversation.